All right, all right. Buenos días. Bienvenidos a nuestro segundo día del
Good
diálogo
morning.
regional.
Welcome to our second day of this regional policy dialogue on capital markets, CapiLAC. Before I introduce myself, and just so we are all clear on what to do, we will give you some brief logistical instructions.
Before I introduce myself and we get to start our event, let us give you some logistics. Primero, vamos a tener traducción simultánea a lo largo de todo el evento.
We will be offering simultaneous interpretation throughout the event. It's very easy. You just need to look at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a computer or on a telephone, you will see at the bottom globe icon. There you can choose the language of your preference. Let's give you a few moments to set that up.
We will have simultaneous interpretation. Choosing the language is very simple. At the bottom of your screen, if you are in a PC, or at the top of your screen, if you are in a cell phone, you will find a globe icon. By clicking on it, you will choose the language of your preference. I will give you 5 seconds so you can just adjust your preferences. Bueno, ahora que han ajustado su lenguaje, los invitamos
a que... that's taken care of, we encourage you to participate in the event. You can send in your questions through our Q&A icon. It's also at the bottom of your screen if you're looking at a computer screen. And we will also be using the chat. It's on the right of your screen, and we'll use that to send you relevant information and links that are useful for all of us. Sara will now post the links to all the presentations, documents, bios of our speakers and panelists, and all the information for CapiLAC 2022. At the end of the session, we'll also ask you to fill out a satisfaction survey. And this is very important to us. Please fill it out. That will allow us to improve our events in the future. And next year, we're hoping to have a CapiLAC that is even better than this year's. If that's even possible, we'll tell you now what we have in store for you today. I'm Diego Herrera, lead specialist in financial markets at the IDB, together with FIAB and ACSDA, the Ibero-American Association of Exchanges and the Association of Securities Depositories of the Americas. We have designed a very interesting agenda for our CapiLAC 2022. I want to thank everyone from FIAB and from ACSDA, Olga Cantillo, Ruth Butterell, and all the people who are a part of their teams. Without them, it would not have been possible for us to hold this event. Also, I'd like to thank our own team led by Ana Maria and all of us who are here, Jaime, Sahara, Gonzalo, Daniela, and all those people who are helping us out from Argentina with the production team, as well as our interpretation team. Thank you very much to all of you. You are also essential for this interesting event to take place. This year, we're talking about sustainable financing of the productive sector from the capital markets. And we can't talk about this sector without talking about the MSMEs in our sectors. So we'll have a very fulfilling day filled with knowledge and exchange.
So as I was mentioning, for our first topic for our CapiLAC 5, we will talk about MSMEs. We're going to talk about how to finance MSMEs through our capital markets. And as Susana will introduce them later, we will have the honor of having today 2 very special guests. One of them was my professor at NYU Stern, Professor Ed Alman. This is a treat for me. I'm very happy to have him here, but Susana is going to introduce them properly. So for that purpose, I'm going to give the floor to Mrs. Susana Cordero Guerra. She is the manager for the Institutions for Development Department at IDB, and she's going to be the host for our first keynote speakers for today. Mrs. Cordero Guerra, please go ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diego, for this warm welcome. It's a pleasure to moderate this discussion on how capital markets are responding to financing gaps for MSMEs in the region. Let me first introduce our guest today, Professor Edward Altman, who is the Max L. Hein Professor of Finance Emeritus at NYU's Stern Business School and the Director of Research in Credit and Debt Markets at the NYU Solomon Center for the Study of Financial Institutions. Before serving in this position, Professor Altman chaired the Stern School's MBA program for 12 years. He has produced ample research and publications on corporate bankruptcy, high-yield bonds, distressed debt, and credit risk analysis, having developed the internationally renowned Altman Z-score model for bankruptcy prediction of companies. Welcome, Professor Altman. Also joining us is Gabriel Sabato, who is currently the head of Wiserfunding, a London-based fintech specialized in assessing the credit risk of SMEs. Gabriel is a risk manager with deep expertise in the current regulatory context in consumer and SME lending. So we now turn to our topic today. As Diego previewed, MSME financing is a most relevant topic for productive development in Latin America and the Caribbean. And in terms of, we look at sheer numbers, they comprise 99.5% of the businesses in the region, 60% of the employed population, and 25% of the GDP. But despite their size and relevance, MSMEs have had encountered many challenges in accessing credit. And some estimates show that this gap can reach up to 30% of the regional GDP. So drawing on capital markets to finance MSMEs is not a novel concept. There are many different cases that our guests will discuss. But the key challenge is that it has not reached scale. Professor Altman and Gabriel will share the findings from an upcoming study that will be published in early next year. It was ran jointly by the IDB and the Ibero-American Federation of Exchanges. And this study compares the experiences of different countries in the region, among them Chile, Colombia, Jamaica, among others, to best practices in Europe and Asia. And we will now turn to a presentation that will discuss the main findings from the study, but also contemplate different policy recommendations and good practices that we could potentially apply and expand in the region. I now turn to our guests and this what is to be a very interesting presentation on these findings. Thank you, Professor Altman and Gabriel. Professor Altman, I think you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Susanna, for that wonderful introduction. And good morning, buenos dias to everyone listening in. It's an enormous honor and pleasure for me and Gabriele Sabato to be involved with you today to report on the study that was introduced just a few minutes ago that we've been involved with for many months now, working very closely with the team from IDB and CapiLAC with a number of many interviews, surveys, etc. I'm working now with Gabriele on the slides, and we now go right directly to our study. It was certainly introduced to you the importance of MSMEs. One question is, why did we get involved with this study? Indeed, first of all, of course, we were asked to consider being the principal investigator on this study by Diego some months ago. And indeed, I have been studying the credit risk aspects of companies now, maybe for almost 100 years. Well, maybe not that much, but going back to 1968. the origin of the model, which is known as the Z-score model. In 2003, I was introduced to and was inviting Gabriele Sabato to visit at NYU. And together, we decided that one of the areas of research that had not been addressed with any sort of precision or academic rigor was the credit risk aspects of micro, small, medium-sized companies. And so we, at that time, began a research program, mainly using publicly available data at NYU when Gabriele was a visiting scholar. And from that emanated a number of studies, including those that dealt with SMEs in their relationship to the new Basel requirements for capital adequacy of banks. They were treated differently. And the question was why? And also, what sort of models, what sort of information, what sort of metrics could be used to evaluate the credit health of these companies? We kept in touch after these studies when Gabriele went back to Europe, became a very successful banker for a number of Dutch and British institutions. And then in 2016, I was asked by the Borsa Italiana, the stock exchange in Italy, if I could put together a model specifically for SMEs in Italy that were coming to market directly to issue bonds called mini bonds of a size of between 1 and say 20 million euros in size. This was a new innovation, primarily sponsored by the Italian government and the stock exchange in Italy. And their quest was for an objective third-party assessment of the financial health of companies issuing these bonds so that investors could have confidence in the information and there wouldn't be this asymmetric information that usually involves small companies with very little information on them and medium and large size investors. I immediately thought of Gabriele to assist me in this because it was a big undertaking. And we, within 6 months, built for Borsa the first generation model dealing with SME credit risk evaluation in Italy. It worked very well. It was based only on financial data at that time. And to this day, Borsa is still using it as an entree, as a way of adding to the transparency of information for SMEs. This was our first experience. Having that experience, we decided that if it worked so well in Italy, why not other countries? And we formed Wiserfunding. We launched it in 2019 after a good deal of time building new models for the UK, for Europe. Indeed, today we have built more than 60 models globally to look at not only SMEs from the standpoint of an alternative form of financing, namely debt financing, as opposed to perhaps IPOs in the equity market, but to try to form, and this is really important and something that we're going to come back to at the end of our discussion on our analysis of Latin America and the Caribbean, to provide a common language of credit that everyone can understand and to make decisions based on that. And that common language of credit dealt with a bond rating equivalent of companies that are too small to issue and get rated by large rating agencies, which of course charge great deals of money for that rating. we provided at that time, first in Italy, then in the UK, and then in Europe, and now globally, this common language of credit through a bond rating equivalent and a probability of default. Today, we have more than 65, perhaps more than 70 as we're speaking, global clients, where we are providing the information mainly from financial and non-financial data using artificial intelligence techniques and other forms of data to provide a more holistic assessment of the credit risk of small and medium-sized companies. When the invitation came to us to look at Latin America and the Caribbean from IDB, from CapiLAC, we were and we felt very confident that we could provide a similar type of analysis, but also we wanted to find out what was going on in the development of SME alternative financings by country. And so we began our study. I'm going to turn it over to Gabriele now to talk more about the details of what we looked at and how we looked at that. Gabriele?
Thank you so much, Ed. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much to Diego, Susanna, and all the organizers. This is a real privilege. And Ed, you have already covered a very important point, why we started this work. When we received first the research proposal from Diego, we immediately felt that this was an incredibly interesting topic. We had experience in Europe. We had seen a lot of initiatives across Europe to support SME funding, in particular through capital markets. And the idea to explore this in Latin America was just very important to us. So we felt, obviously, there was a very strong motivation to be part of this project. And through it, it just grew. We all know, Susanna mentioned at the start, SMEs, MSME, so micro, small, and medium-sized companies in Latin America represent a vast majority, more than 99% of all companies in Latin America. More than 27 million of companies there. And traditionally, they have been defined a little bit like the missing middle. So that part of the economy, just in the middle between consumers and large corporates, that has been, in a certain way, always overlooked, especially in their funding needs. So the missing middle. And the research proposal was really to investigate if capital markets can play a role in supporting that missing middle, in creating a new opportunity for them to raise capital, to raise funds, working capital or long-term capital for their needs, for them to grow. That gap in particular has been estimated as 1.8 trillion very recently. I mean, the International Development Bank has published already many studies on this. And that was our starting point. Then, obviously, we had to explore the context in which these companies operate. Generally, in Latin America, there was a strong reliance on bank lending, not that different from what we saw in Europe before the great financial crisis, the 2008-2009 crisis. That was a little bit kind of moment where things started to evolve and new channels like the mini bond in Italy became a reality in Europe. So obviously, when alternatives are not that developed, for SMEs, there is only one opportunity, the banking sector. And sometimes it may be difficult for them to break through. We have, through our study, explored many of these situations where, request for guarantees, long times, waiting times, and all elements that make that funding very difficult. Accessing funds, it cannot be that long, especially if you are a small company and you have needs that need to be fulfilled in a short period of time. So we felt again that our experience across Europe could really be helpful in driving this study forward and understanding if those initiatives could be replicated across Latin America. The reality is, when we started, we didn't know much. And we were extremely surprised of what we learned. I mean, we spoke to many countries. We'll go through details in a minute, but we noticed that there were already initiatives across many countries in Latin America in that space to support MSMEs through capital markets. And some of these had been already quite successful. So we wanted to understand what were the driving factors for the success. And from that point, we thought that starting from the experience across Europe was probably the right thing to do. So first thing we had to do, obviously, was to create a strong research team. And again, I'd like to thank very much Professor Altman, who has led this incredible effort, and all the team there at IDB, led by Diego, Anna Maria, Jaime, and so many. We also included two professors in Europe, Marcus Mead and Rani Krain, who have helped us to go through a massive amount of information. We have actually, at the start, decided to go through two types of research methodologies. The first, using interviews, with probably the biggest and the most successful experiences across Latin America. So we set 15 of those, and then surveys. We sent surveys across all FIAB members, and we received 93% response on this. So a very significant coverage there between exchanges and regulators. Yes, because that is key, and we understood this right at the start. The collaboration between exchanges and regulators was going to be the driving factor for success. We'll go through this later in the findings of our study. So once assembled this strong research team, then we collected all this data, and we got ready then to come up with our findings. As I mentioned, we went to Europe first. This was probably the ground where we had some experience. Professor Altman just mentioned how we started at Wiserfunding. The experience in Italy started in 2013, a market that grew significantly, where a lot of companies, MSMEs, felt comfortable more and more to go directly to investors and raise funds. So a very important initiative that has provided funding to many Italian SMEs. Then obviously the London Stock Exchange, another very important player, I would say globally, one of the first to come up with a specific session in their market for MSMEs. Again, not just to raise funds, and this is something we will discuss later, but also to learn. Because MSMEs are small companies, and very often they don't have that experience of dealing with investors. So building that experience through maybe debt instruments or small sections of the stock exchange dealing with small companies helps them to grow faster and become larger companies. So that was another very important experience. Germany. I think in Germany, we saw many exchanges that try to launch products, especially debt products for SMEs. And so that was another element we wanted to capture and learn more about. And BME in Spain, again, a successful experience, both in terms of equity and debt to support SMEs. So these were all very important experiences that we wanted to bring. And that's where we started from, to learn what we thought were the most successful elements in their propositions, so that we would have been able to compare those to Latin America and what is happening there.
Gabriele, quick reminder to mind your time. Sorry.
Yes, thank you, Diego. And in fact, let's move to the findings, and probably I'll pass it to you. So what were the findings across Europe?
Well, major findings, and just in the interest of time, you can read it as I'm speaking, were that debt instruments are generally a very good way to introduce MSMEs to capital markets, many times in preparation for future IPOs of their equity. Exchanges that have, however, limited the investment in the debt instruments to institutional investors, sophisticated investors, was very important, rather than opening it up in the beginning to retail investors. Importantly, and we'll come back to this, that these institutional investors need to have more information than simply the name and perhaps the sector of the companies. So this common language needed to be provided. Government incentives were critical. Subsidies, guarantees, discounts in many cases to help the investors get comfortable and make it a reasonable rate of return for them, and at the same time to encourage MSMEs to come to the market by providing some sort of subsidies when necessary. Exchanges are often expected to do the screening and assessing the risk profile of SMEs. Many times they are not geared to do that, and so they need assistance from either private enterprises, fintechs, and seasoned professionals in the credit space. Finally, the collaboration with fintech and benefit speed of innovation and digitalization helps to make this process more efficient, because the small firms simply do not have the resources to pay the usual type of underwriting fees and rating agency fees coming to market. And so we have to look for efficiencies in that. Those are the main findings from Europe. Let's move on to the next slide, Gabriele.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. And so how this compared with the LAC region, so Latin American and the Caribbean region. So 75% of the exchanges that we serve that were already considering to offer that products to support MSMEs. So this was a very important, almost never there was this feeling that, oh no, we never thought about this. And if it wasn't debt, would have been equity. But the vast majority, as you can see, were already considering to offer debt instruments to fund SME needs, and within the next 24 months. So, well advanced stage. As I mentioned before, the collaboration with the regulator, we found this to be kind of the key element to drive forward that proposition. When the regulator and the exchange were working together to make sure that the rules applied to this specific part of the market were tailored to small companies, that was the most successful experience. And then obviously, what type of interest they had? Well, sometimes exchanges, they wanted to basically run marketplaces to offer this debt product to MSMEs, or some other times, and I remember in particular the Colombian example with Ascenso, where basically there was a great collaboration between the exchange and the fintech. So these were the two options. Rarely we found the interest of the exchange to run that specific offering on their main platform where they would trade bond on stocks. So more like run as a marketplace or collaboration with a fintech. And I mentioned Colombia. I think, Colombia is probably one of the most successful we noticed there in the region as an experience of collaboration between exchange and fintech, but also great learnings from the Jamaican experience, Argentina, and Peru. Most of these were specifically focused to working capital solutions that can support MSMEs to fund, for example, their invoices. So very interesting. And we now learned that, for example, in Chile very recently, a new law has been approved. And so a lot is developing there faster. But as I mentioned, is that collaboration between the regulator and the market that makes a big difference. As I had mentioned, government incentives, they were key. Obviously, when we started this, we were just probably towards the end of a very difficult period because of the COVID pandemic. So many governments had put in place specific measures, including guarantees for mini bonds. And again, that had given a boost to many of those experiences and products. But in general, and this is something we noticed also in Europe, having some sort of tax discounts or subsidies for both MSMEs or investor was a way to incentivize the use and create awareness. Like every new market needs that at the start. The second part, proportionality. I think this was probably one of the words we heard most often. Need to be proportional requirements for SMEs. It cannot be one size fits all, because obviously MSMEs are very different from large corporates, and just cascading the requirements of large corporates to MSMEs wouldn't be the right solution. So that proportionality of requirements, making sure that the requirements which are needed, obviously, are proportional to the size of the company, that was a key element. And just to close there, then obviously investors. 64% of the exchanges believed that institutional investors would be interested. But many times they flagged that was extremely hard to basically capture their interest. So maybe they say they are interested, but then more difficult than to get them to really invest. And that brought some of those countries or early initiatives to focus on retail investors. Potentially shorter maturities and strong credit assessment could be solutions to further incentivize institutional investors. It's only when institutional investors really get involved that the amount of funds available become something that could really serve this vast number of MSMEs. So incentivize and attracting interest of institutional investor was probably perceived as a key element to move forward. The last point, and this was very interesting, you know, in the survey, we asked the question of what barriers had been encountered when building MSME funding proposition. And, you know, obviously, regulatory constraint was probably the first, but interesting enough, the second was lack of interest from MSMEs. Why? Well, again, we believe that this is linked to risk awareness and risk culture lacking very often from the MSME side. So building that culture and that awareness is absolutely key to make sure that the demand is there when such initiatives are put in place. So I thought that this had to be flagged specifically, and a very important point. And then we can close then with our conclusions and recommendation. Ed, I will hand over back to you to cover this.
Okay, let's go very quickly because we've mentioned many of these points earlier. Regulators and exchanges should work together. That's kind of obvious, but it needs to be emphasized continuously that we can't do it just with exchanges. We can't do it just with regulators. We need them working as a team. Investing in financial education for the MSMEs is absolutely critical. You cannot expect this market to grow if the companies themselves are leery, are concerned, are scared about entering into a capital market contract and to expose themselves to the credibility assessment and indeed open up their operations to investors, potential investors. So we have to talk to the MSMEs. Governments, exchanges need to make possible educational programs, invite them, incentivize the MSMEs. More emphasis on a credit culture. What do I mean by a credit culture? It means that metrics that are used by sophisticated banks and non-bank lenders need to be understood by the companies that are being evaluated so that they will see the importance of opening up their operations, exposing their profitability information so that they can get funds at reasonable rates. So a common language of credit that is understood by investors and by issuers needs to be fostered as much as possible by the regulator, by the exchanges, and by third-party operators. Gabriele, why don't you complete the final recommendations?
Sure. And I guess the next point is very much around speeding up the growth of those markets. What we noticed many times, as we mentioned before, is that if there isn't a little bit of push at the start, it tends to be very slow and potentially die after a while because of lack of interest. So proportional requirements and tax incentives or guarantees were actually wonderful tools to kind of speed up that growth and incentivize investor and MSMEs to come together and use this incredible opportunity. The next point, really, what products? Well, as a start, we found that most of the times mini bond and factoring were kind of great products to offer for long-term and short-term funding needs of the MSMEs. And in particular, countries that had put in place centralized public registers for invoices have an advantage there to check and control the type of invoices that get funded. So that was definitely a very good incentive. And last, obviously the collaboration between regulators and exchanges, but also between exchanges and fintechs. That collaboration can speed up the process and make it more sustainable and sound. So something that obviously we felt should be encouraged. And with that, I think I'd like to conclude. Ed, I don't know if you have any final remark.
I know there was a question about elaboration on mini bonds. We have some articles that we've written on the mini bond industry and how Wiserfunding interacted with it. But basically, underwriters, either banks or non-banks, specialists in debt financing, put together a prospectus on a company's operation, how much money they need for various purposes, usually up to around 20 million euros in Europe, but it'll be $20 million in the US now, or in Latin America, the equivalent. And the underwriter finds institutional investors to take on this, sometimes with subsidies from the government or from working with tax incentives. They then come to the market, and then the stock exchanges play the role of providing secondary trading, so that it is a liquid instrument as well as one that is a buy and hold strategy on the part of the investor. Very quickly, that's a summary. Perhaps, Susanna, now we should go to you back, and thank you all very much for your patience.
No, thank you, Professor Altman and Gabriel. This was a very thoughtful presentation, and I think juxtaposes well the Latin American experience with that of more developed countries. And I wanted to go back to this contrast between the challenges we're facing in the region and the more developed markets. And it seems to me that the findings all point to this very strong binding constraint of having a yet to be strengthened ecosystem. And this ecosystem has two elements to them that you've highlighted well in your presentation, which is SMEs capabilities, which speaks to financial education, which speaks to the lack of the common credit culture language that you were talking about, the common language of credit, which speaks to, boils down to the financial need for financial education more broadly. And then another component, which is the regulatory challenges and the need for proportionality that you so well elaborated. So this points to the fact that while the exchanges and the regulators are collaborating well, and there seems to be coordination based on your surveys, there is a weak demand happening, and it's a structural factor. And I was wondering if you could point to some examples in Europe, and the first that comes to mind based on the paper is the UK Elite program. And, ways in which we could, in the region, tropicalize some of these programs so that we can potentially overcome these structural barriers. So how would you think about doing that so that perhaps we could create a hybrid pathway to enhance and accelerate this evolution among MSMEs so that they can catch up to the demand and coordination that we see among exchanges and regulators?
Gabriele, I think you can handle the British experience.
Sure. I think, Susanna, this is a critical question, really. We definitely noticed that across Europe, very often these debt markets were not just used for funding, but sometimes also to learn. So companies themselves understood that having exposure to investor was actually probably the first step to get closer to markets. And sometimes they were actually willing to pay a premium compared to the bank rate. Sometimes the yield that they were paying on mini bonds was actually higher, but they were willing to do that for the exposure and for the learning. And so you're absolutely right. It's about building that knowledge and that credit culture that, you know, brings them closer to the market, learning to deal with investors, and potentially moving towards an IPO and becoming a public company. So definitely capital markets can play a role in the education, but it shouldn't be, you mentioned the elite program, it shouldn't be just something for few elite, right? I think what we noticed is that having programs where this type of education is offered to many MSMEs in the region would really benefit them, just even to start to understand the opportunities that they have.
And also, I'd like to emphasize that in the mini bond experience in Italy, the biggest constraint is convincing the small and medium-sized companies to actually come to market. And once that is overcome, the investors are there. We are confident they are there, perhaps for the slightly higher yield that they were getting, but also the diversification that they could enjoy with large numbers of SMEs coming to market at a reasonably similar point in time. And finally, the point that I think was made several times, but maybe not strong enough, is SMEs need to understand the importance of coming to market, the credibility that they have to their own customers, to their own investors, the fact that they could brag that they have qualified to issue bonds to sophisticated investors. And it's up to the regulators, it's up to the underwriters to reinforce this point on a continuous basis. It's a challenge, no question about it. And very importantly, and this is something that, you know, is potentially a problem in any market of debt instruments, is to understand there will be defaults. They will happen, especially in lower credit quality companies. But those risks need to be understood clearly by the investors beforehand. And we can't have markets failing because everyone thinks a debt instrument must be repaid. Absolutely. One of the problems in Germany was the fact that there were too many defaults, and that market did not thrive like the Italian market, which has had defaults, but much more limited because the investors understand, either through established rating agencies or with metrics like our Wiserfunding probability of default and bond rating equivalents, what they are getting into. And the SMEs understand what metrics are being used to evaluate them.
Professor
Sorry
Altman,
for the long answer.
No. This is a very interesting point, and it goes to fomenting this culture. Have you seen any opportunities or examples in these more developed countries where we could leapfrog? You know, the region could overcome some of these challenges in a faster way, either using technology or other instruments?
I think it's a great point. We cannot be drawn out. And the cost involved has to be absorbed by, governments in terms of subsidies at the start to get it going. We emphasize that point on and on again. The Colombia experience, I think, was one where they understood very well that in the beginning, it was very difficult to come to market with these new innovations without government support at the start. And it's hard for even the exchanges to make profits early on. It's only with more volume that and more scalability that you can do so. In terms of leapfrogging, as you said, the timing, digitalization is very important. The fact that a lot of these information can be digitized, that there is now available from the cloud information, non-financial as well as financial, on companies, using tax records, using bank invoices, invoice financing, factoring, an exchange that process that information much more quickly. I think the IDB themselves, people from them can speak to this issue, because I think it's one of their main objectives is to, accelerate the process. You personally probably have more experience than we do on the challenges of acceleration. But that's all my comments on this. Perhaps Gabriele has a comment on the speed. By the way, it may sound self-serving, but we can do a credit risk evaluation on an SME. All we need is the name of the company or their tax identification number in under 10 seconds. Any company that is out there in the cloud and information, with good technology, you don't need days and weeks to evaluate the credit. Under 10 seconds, and we can show this very clearly. It's one of the real revelations in not only but in new credit metrics that are coming to market.
Professor Altman, unfortunately, we're pressed for time.
I know that.
I would like to thank you and Gabrielle and end on this very positive note and an optimism for the region, in the sense that we can draw on these newly evolving technologies to try to leapfrog and accelerate this process. The IDB is working on several of them, and this study really provides us with a platform to triage and the kinds of experiments and opportunities that we can strengthen and expand on. So I think we're on a very solid ground to support those examples that are working well, like the one in Colombia that you mentioned, and find ways in which we can bridge these information and coordination failures that we see, and help governments have the most, provide the most benefits from the subsidies that they do provide for these SMEs going forward. So with that, I wanted to thank you for participating, for the thoughtful presentation and comments, and Gabrielle, and I turn to Diego for the next panel.
Thank you very much, Susana. Thank you, Professor Altman. It's always a pleasure to see you again and again. I think you're getting tired of me. and Gabriele, thank you very much. This was a great experience. And as Susana mentioned before, we will publish this document in early 2023. So everyone is more than welcome to read it. We will make enough noise so you can notice, download it, and read it. And with that, I want to move forward to our next panel, which is going to be both in English and Spanish. I would like to first introduce our guests for today. I will keep on in English for now, for the time being. So first, I would like to introduce our speakers for today. We have Mr. Miguel Ángel Zapatero. He's the CEO for the Lima Stock Exchange, which is part of the group Bolsa de Valores de Lima. He's the main infrastructure provider in the Peruvian market, and now they have merged with the Colombian and the Chilean markets. And Mr. Zapatero joined BVL in 2014, and he worked also in BlackRock and some other important positions in the financial sector. I don't know, Miguel Ángel, are you going to speak in Spanish or English? ¿Español?
Español, está bien, es okay. Gracias.
Perfecto,
I can speak in Spanish, that would be fine. Okay, so I will switch to Spanish. We know, Miguel Ángel, that your time is limited, so we want to give you the floor first so you can tell us from your perspective, from the ground and from the Lima Stock Exchange, how you see the evolution of these capital markets that are now trying to finance SMEs. Go ahead, and thank you very much for being with us. Thank you very much, Diego. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you. At the Lima Stock Exchange, a lot of what we prioritize is our role precisely as a stock exchange, and in having a deep market that has liquidity, that is efficient, and is especially inclusive. And when I talk about inclusivity, we mean that we want to have open doors for local, international, individual investors, institutional investors, but also for all kinds of businesses. These markets shouldn't just be seen as something for blue chips and corporations. The exchange should serve that purpose of making financing easier, opening up opportunities, and as all over the world, and as we've heard by Professor Altman and others, most of the companies that exist in the world are small and medium-sized enterprises. So in this context, this is an ongoing project. We've had several different initiatives that we've put forth over the years. We've experimented together with the support of regulators and the governments at the time, and it's ongoing. We've tried different systems. We've tried to simplify the debt issuance system, and I would say that this has been a positive experience in general. We've had very good experiences. A medium-sized enterprise, about 15 million or $18 million, they've gotten financing 5% per year, short-term. And it was 25 issuers that have been participating in this market for 8 years. It doesn't mean that there haven't been other companies that have explored this, and we've talked about this with structures. Over 80 businesses that have explored this and have chosen other instruments, private placement, private fund financing. It's a benefit of entering an alternative market. It has helped them in this regard.
But we believe that this process has a space. We continue pushing for it. There are a number of companies that are working, but there's a minimum scale that is required for this to be successful and sustainable. Another strategy which we made, which is closer to MSMEs, is the experience with Cabal. That has been the best success story, which has been mentioned by the study carried out by the IDB. And I believe that it was a very interesting example, which can be replicated in other countries and which has had quite an important impact. This experience started a number of years ago. 2016 was the start. And today, we are recording in the central deposit more than $600 million of invoices, which are recorded electronically. And these are invoices of small and medium size corporations, more than 25,000 corporations. And these invoices are financed and they are factoring candidates. It is a very important market. $160 million during the first year in 2016. And I believe that it has been a very interesting success story. Excellent. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask you about the experience of Cabali. How much does it cost a corporation to dematerialize their invoicing and put it in a central deposit? We do not need the exact amount, but I would like to know how expensive it is, because the Peruvian example is an example which many jurisdictions in the region could adopt, and it could be a way to replicate good practices. Factoring is not a usual practice in many countries of the region, and it is an excellent opportunity for many MSMEs to finance, especially the working capital. So how much does it cost? Because it sounds like it's very expensive, but perhaps it is not. Excellent question. What does Cabali do? Cabali is a central deposit which is owned by the exchange. The exchange is part of a holding, and the holding is the 100% owner of the exchange. We, as Cabali, register the instruments, but the financing is carried out by banks and factoring enterprises. So you need to record the invoice, or if you want to challenge the invoice. But on average, the cost is less than $1. The invoices can be of different amounts, but we're talking about $40,000 or $50,000 on average. Sometimes they can go down to $30,000 or $20,000, but we have also seen invoices of more than $100,000 and $200,000. It depends on the size of the corporation. So the cost of registering this is not the important thing. What is important is the financing cost. And this depends a little bit about the company. When we're talking about factoring, it is an advance of liquidity in exchange for an invoice, where you don't have a line with the payee. What these companies do is they analyze the risk of these small corporation, because there are 260 public companies in the exchange, but there are over 1 million small corporations. So these are private corporations. So it's kind of complex. The rates are around the 9 and 10% yearly. It could be much higher. In the past, we were talking about rates of 15 and 20% of financing for the small enterprises. But this is the financing during the life of the invoice, which could be 60 days or less. So when we're talking about $6 billion or $1 billion in an economy of $200 billion, which is being financed with invoices. So this has an important impact. And with this compression opportunity of reduction of the financing costs, which are quite interesting. So there are challenges, but we're making progress. I believe that it is perfectly clear, Miguel Angel, and I reiterate that this is a different way of seeing what are the possibilities of financing for MSMEs in the capital market. This is a legal mechanism which is traditionally used in trade, but which requires some legal clarifications. Before finishing and giving the floor to Juan Pablo or Lima in Colombia to see what happened with them over the last year, I wanted to ask you precisely this, because we have supported some of the rules that give the possibility of doing factoring in some of the countries. And one of the specifics of the legislation in Peru, Chile, and Mexico, for instance, is how possible it is to execute the invoice, how this possibility of executing the invoice has an important role to play. And what happens when you have already dematerialized it in the securities deposit? Yes, it is important. What I liked a lot about the study of Professor Altman is that it is making a lot of, it's highlighting a lot the fact that the uncertainty and the possibility of recovering the expected amount. So sometimes the factoring world depends on the main line of credit of the corporation. In this world, to convert this invoice issued by a company in a security, by converting it in a security, it acquires much more seniority as far as being executable, as being acceptable. And in addition to that, some incentives and penalties are established if this process needs to be interrupted. So that is why we are trying to avoid disincentives. At the same time, the mechanism is connected to the fiscal authority. So somehow, at the time when you use this sort of invoice, you know that it is a lot more certain than the previous one, because this is already reflected to the tax authorities. So this is a perfect triangulation. So this is something major. In the case of the 50 or 60 days, the main banks of the countries, there are more than 90 factoring companies. There used to be only 5 or 6. No, I believe there are 100 right now, which we are using right now. And it is quite comfortable to use this process. And in the past, you would have letters of exchange, or you had to go to get all this notarized. Now, everything is electronic. In Cavalli, we have a module which allows corporations for a couple of dollars in a very efficient way to raise the flag of the invoice, here am I, and they immediately get a reply. So the process is very simplified. And this is we really needed to educate the market on these aspects, not only with MSMEs, but also with PAYs, with bankers, and with the judges, courts, chambers of commerce. This was a very intensive work, which needs to be continuous because there is a natural rotation and the market continues to grow. Yes. Somebody asked, why don't you pay electronically? Because if the legal aspect is taken care of, then the invoice is sufficient. And I believe Miguel Angel, and I see that Dr. Juan Pablo has already connected himself. It is important to have a pilot using blockchain for the follow-up of the invoices. That would possibly be an interesting step. And I will leave this on the table for you to think about. Yes, there are technological possibilities of improving this. This is a very interesting aspect because somehow the idea is to increase information, reduce uncertainty. So the central deposit space already gives confidence to all players, bankers and non-banking institutions. Even non-interested parties and the government get to see this. So this is quite an interesting mechanism. And I believe that technologies, for instance, for fund transfers in order to collect are opportunities which can be explored. We could talk about this for hours. Before finishing, I would like to thank you for participating in this regional dialogue, which the IDB organizes on a regular basis. I think that it is very interesting. We lose a little bit of the, we lose sight of how urgent matters some things are. And it is good to take the time to learn about the developments of our respective countries. Thank you so much, Miguel Angel. I am going to ask you to remain for as long as you can. We do know that you have a commitment. That's why I called on you first, changing our original order of business. Yes, thank you. I apologize, but I will stay on for as long as possible. And now, with these words, I will give the floor to Dr. Juan Pablo Corva, who's the president of the Colombian Stock Exchange, who was, as Professor Altman mentioned, Professor Juan Pablo from Colombia. This is the example that can be followed to how to generate financing of MSMEs from capital markets. We are very interested in listening to you to see how things went during the last year and how did the situation changed. Do you have a presentation or would you like to have a dialogue? Good day, Diego. Thank you, everybody. Special greetings from the Colombian Stock Exchange. And thank you so much for changing the order of the presentations because this also gave me time to be here. We have a presentation which puts in perspective what is a sensor, which you already know about. I was very pleased to listen to Professor Altman, who considers that this effort is the road to take. So we are truly very happy and satisfied, and we will be happy to share this experience with the colleagues in the region. In other fora, we have shared this experience, and we have heard that many countries are interested in working this way because this is a challenge for all of us. The main financing problem is not for main corporations, the big infrastructure projects. The main financing challenge is the financing of pymes and financial inclusion, and to see how we can sophisticate the analysis, the credit analysis of these corporations. In many of our cases, these are informal enterprises or corporations which are trying to be formal. So access to financing becomes difficult. And at the end of the day, if there is no financing, it is very difficult to obtain scalability. And if we do not get scalability, then we are not able to attain the expected productivity. So this is an effort which we have based on the Colombian structure, but we believe that it could be replicated in other countries. If it is okay with you, we will quickly go through the presentation. Some elements are probably well known to all of you, but I believe that we can talk about it. In the first slide, we have the statistics of what we have obtained. Ascenso, which is the name of our platform, which is 3 years old. We have $60 million which have been financed, 137 successful corporation, over 10,000 investors, 47,000 investments. and we have a 27% conversion rate, and 60% of those people have invested more than once in the platform. So these are the figures. $16 million doesn't look like a lot of money, but it is for 137 corporations. If you had the time, you could look at the video, you would see what can be the effect of this on an MSME. What do we offer in Ascenso? And what are we providing to our clients? An alternative way to be financing, to issue debt in the country, a new risk segment for investors. So in general, a person do not have access to a credit portfolio of this nature. So the return ratio is different. We give a lot of autonomy to corporations, which is something that they like a lot with regard to the financial conditions, especially MSMEs. When they go to a bank, the financing conditions are dictated by the bank, 12 months, 18 months, and this is the rate, whatever. But here in the platform, the corporation has a lot of control over the maturity, how is the amortization schedule prepared, and also the yield it's going to offer investors. So this is a very important aspect of that the exchange offers. On the other hand, something that is very valuable is that by working with the stock exchange, they get a very high visibility. So we inform this through the social media of the exchange, and this gives corporations very high visibility. So this has been something that is much appreciated by entrepreneurs. This solution is 100% digital, and it's part of the exchange ecosystem. So it is interesting for the corporations, but also for investors, because they have the support of the Colombian Stock Exchange. And this reassures them things are going to turn out well. Let's go on to the next slide. Here you have some data about the profile of the enterprises. We were talking about 137 corporations that have already obtained their financing. There were 7 campaigns that were on view, and 99% were successful. We were able to calibrate these campaigns so that they are successful. The average financing is of about $100,000, and the range is from 20,000 as a minimum to 800,000 as the maximum amount obtained. And the average rate for the past 3 years is about 11.20. Until last year, we had an average of 10.5%. They went up to 14 or 15%. And due to the situation in Colombia,
I'm sorry, in any case, it's financing with different terms and very competitive interest rates, even better than the alternatives that businesses have. From the perspective of investors, there are some interesting benefits as well. We have about 36,000 accounts that have been created. The average number of people who approach a campaign is rather large. We have about 342 people on average financing a campaign, so the risk is well distributed. It's distributed among 342 investors in an average financing. And it's about $100,000. That's about the average investment. So that it provides a share that's about $1,000 per investor. And that's good from the perspective of risk management. The biggest portfolio, it has 122 investments. This person has been very active on the platform, and the biggest portfolio is 95,000, but an average one is about $250. And this is a good way to manage risk. And it's also nice in terms of financial inclusiveness. An SME that has its campaign on the platform has on average 350 people, each one providing about $250. And with all of that, they're able to finance a project. So it's a matter of financial inclusiveness or inclusivity in this crowdfunding. One of the aspirations then for Ascenso is to continue to try to provide a full offer of options. Here's the curve. You start with an idea for a business. You're financed by the entrepreneur or entrepreneurs. There's a phase where you have family, friends, and then you go through the valley of death during the first to the third year, and there where the external financing for the company is very hard to get. And then if the company survives after 3 years and matures, then there's that cycle of access to formal financing that we know. And what we've wanted to do is to go from what is normal to finance 3-5-year-old businesses and push that back. How can we competitively finance businesses that are in more initial stages? And we financed companies that have been around for 1 year. So that would be about a minimum, and invoicing about $200,000 or $250,000. And then they're eligible to be financed in Colombia. And really, for many businesses, has made the difference, because that youth of companies makes them ineligible for banking services, banking finances, and then they don't have that source. And then what they have now is a small source, but is something that would not otherwise exist for them. And this year we're going to launch Ascenso Equity. We've fallen behind our schedule a bit, but this is going to happen soon. And this would allow us to finance even younger businesses, because when I'm getting started, what I really need is equity and not credit, because I don't have flows. But with equity, we will be able to complete the whole range of financing with the Colombian capital market, with equity financing in early stages through Ascenso, then debt financing in the middle, and then later access to the main capital market, the second market, that's for professional investors, and then the whole range of products in the market with issuing shares and bonds, etc. So we are completing all that supply of financing options in the financial and capital markets, which is different than traditional financing options that existed before. So we're very pleased with this. And as I said before, SMEs have huge financing challenges. OECD and Latin American statistics show us something very similar in terms of what challenges they face, but they're the largest number of businesses we have in our countries. They represent 30% of the GDP, 70% of employment, but only receive 12% of external financing. So finding financing solutions for SMEs is very desirable for our economies, and we're very proud that Ascenso is being seen as a solution at a very small scale, but I think it has a very positive future ahead of it. And now Diego this would be sort of a description of Ascenso's evolution. This has been a difficult year because interest rates have gone up. We've had fewer campaigns than we had hoped, but we've financed still more than we did last year. We didn't grow as much as we wanted to because credit conditions have become much tighter, and for companies, interest rates have risen. But the impact we're having on the market is still positive. And as we had said, we'll leave you with a video because the testimonials by companies that have participated with us and have had access to financing, it's really beautiful to see how this has transformed the lives of these companies. Thank you very much, Juan Pablo. It's very interesting to hear about the development, the evolution of Ascenso. And as we've already mentioned a few times, you're an example of how to do things right. And later we'll ask you a few questions about the scaling and how we can scale up, understanding that you will have access to a broader market now with other countries. And that's going to be very interesting to witness. Now, I'll quickly go on to our next guest, Christian Ederle.
Christian is the head of research at the Bahamas Securities Commission. He has held positions in the financial sector, and also I know for sure, because we have already talked about it, he knows a lot about innovation in the financial markets. And I'm very happy to have you here, Christian. And please talk to us about MSME financing and the vision from the Bahamas. Thank you very much.
Good. Good. Thank you so much, Diego. Always a pleasure to see you again. And thank you for the very kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. And I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today. And I especially thank the IDB for the very gracious invite to this regional capital markets policy dialogue to discuss the intersection between sustainable finance and the importance of the capital markets. And this panel in particular, focusing on financing MSMEs from the capital markets, presents the ideal opportunity for the Securities Commission of the Bahamas, in our capacity as the Securities and Capital Markets Regulator, to discuss some of the initiatives that we have implemented to assist MSMEs in securing financing to fund their commendable business activities in the Bahamas. I am partial, but in my view, the initiatives is the Securities Industry Business Capital Rules, which we refer to as our crowdfunding legislation. And so for the bulk of my presentation this morning, I will provide an overview of the crowdfund rules and will highlight why the Commission decided to adopt this legislation, some of which you've heard from Professor Altman and Dr. Sabato in their earlier presentation. But in the Bahamas, prior to the gazetting of the crowdfund rules, there really was no legislative provision that specifically facilitated MSMEs to source capital in the Bahamas capital markets. Though, of course, the Securities Industry Act 2011 did and does prescribe requirements with respect to the issuing of securities to the public via an initial public offering. But for reasons that I will go into in my presentation, the IPO requirements were not necessarily a viable option for MSMEs. So the Commission recognized the need to introduce and expedite a bespoke regulatory framework to assist small businesses in securing funding in the securities and capital markets. And consequently, pursuant to our mandate and authority to formulate rules to guide the orderly development of the Bahamas' capital markets, we developed and adopted our equity crowdfund rules. So in summary, these equity crowdfund rules, among other things, accomplish the following. They outline the initial and ongoing requirements for MSMEs issuing securities to the public pursuant to a crowdfund offering. They outline the initial and ongoing requirements for crowdfund market intermediaries that connect an MSME issuer with investors and then subsequently trades those securities on a secondary market. And they outline the maximum investment limits for retail investors participating in a crowdfund offering. And perhaps I should clarify here that for the purposes of the crowdfund rules, crowdfunding refers to an equity investment, not bonds as we heard earlier, but an equity investment in or a distribution of securities by a new or established small or medium enterprise. Entities that are not defined as either small or medium enterprises are required to conduct a traditional IPO via the aforementioned Securities Industry Act 2011. Also, it's important to note that as the rules apply to equity crowdfunding only, they do not cover other types of crowdfunding projects, such as rewards-based and donation-based crowdfunding schemes. Those are specifically exempted from the crowdfund rules.
Christian,
So, yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Do you have a presentation?
So I do not, but I'm happy.
Okay,
I don't
sorry.
have one with me, but I'm happy to forward one later afterward, if that's okay. I'm happy.
Sorry, I was just confirming. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do so. Yeah, but I've also in the link provided, in the chat provided, I provided a link to the crowdfund rules so that if you want to examine them more in totality, you can. And I'm happy to forward some crib notes, if you will, that you can disseminate to participants.
Thank you. Please go.
Yeah, sure, of course, certainly. So the crowdfund rules then allow all investors, both retail and accredited, to participate in a crowdfund offering. Pursuant to the rules, a small or micro enterprise can raise up to $5 million in any one offering in the capital markets and can initiate a maximum of 2 crowdfund offerings in any 12-month period. Now, the important incentive with respect to the crowdfund rules is that a micro, small, or medium enterprise is not required to file a full prospectus with the Commission, but rather they are required to file a crowdfund offering document. The advantage here is that it is significantly less expensive to file a document than it is to file a prospectus, approximately 10% of the prospectus filing fee. Also, and as we heard via Professor Altman and Dr. Sabato, generally, most MSMEs have negligible experience with operating in a regulatory environment. So as a result, the Commission decided to introduce these rules that offer reduced initial and continuing regulatory filing requirements. Notwithstanding, however, at a minimum, the crowdfund offering document should contain disclosures about the type of the offering, the persons behind the offering, material risks associated with the offering, and of course, the intended use of the proceeds of the offering. And to ensure that customers and investors are protected, the Commission reviews all disclosures prior to issuing a receipt for the crowdfund offering and requires that quarterly and yearly submission of material information relating to the offering are both publicly and to the Commission disclosed. But similar to public offering shares, crowdfund shares can be traded on a secondary market. However, these shares can only be traded via intermediaries that are registered with the Commission to do so. And in this regard, the crowdfund rules empower the Commission to levy administrative and criminal sanctions for non-compliance to ensure the appropriate protection of investors. Though we have reduced the requirements to file with the Commission, there are, however, important protection for investors that decide to invest in a crowdfund offering. These include, but are not limited to, the following. Firstly, a risk awareness form must be completed by all investors. And with this form, the investors attest that they understand both the risks of the investment and are prepared to invest having regard to those risks. Additionally, investors are offered a right of withdrawal protection, which allows investors up to 3 days, 72 hours, to rescind their investment with the crowdfund issuer. And finally, the Commission has instituted prescribed non-accredited investor limits, which limits the amount of money a retail investor can invest in any one project, $10,000 in any one project, and $50,000 in any 1 year. I do take the advice of Dr. Sabato in his initial presentation where he discussed proportionate regulation, and I agree wholeheartedly with his discussion. And that was an issue that the Commission dealt with as we formed our crowdfund rules. And so to address the issue of proportionality in regulation, the Commission decided that though someone may be constituted as a retail investor, perhaps their experience and investment expertise allows them to recategorize to an accredited investor. So they may not necessarily meet the financial thresholds, but because of their experience in education and investing, they may be able to graduate, if you will, to a professional investor status, and the rules allow them to do so. But most importantly, however, crowdfunding intermediaries have the same full set of AML and KYC obligations as traditional financial institutions such as banks. In our view, this mitigates the risks that bad actors can utilize crowdfunding as a means to engage in illegal activities. And I should add here that the Commission's AML and KYC requirements are derived from international best practices and recommendations, including IOSCO, the International Organization for Securities Commissions. So now that I've given you a background about the rules, I think I should take a step back and explain why the Commission decided that we needed to implement these rules in the first instance. And so the development of the crowdfunding rules was a very thoughtful and deliberate process, born primarily out of 4 factors. Firstly, fueled by Basel and other regulatory capital requirements, the Commission noticed, again, very much mentioned by Professor Altman and Dr. Sabato in their presentation, that post the 2008 financial crisis, the cost of borrowing from banks became increasingly excessive, especially for small and medium enterprises that are often erroneously categorized as inherently more risky when compared with large businesses. Further, the amount of collateral required by banks for MSMEs was a significant barrier for entrepreneurs willing to access funding. Secondly, in addition to banks becoming a less viable option, unfortunately, the securities and capital markets appear to also not offer a viable alternative for small and medium enterprises to secure financing. Traditional avenues, such as going public, with inherent fees such as underwriting, roadshow fees, and with filing prospectuses with the Commission, further restricted the ability for MSEs to secure financing in the capital markets. Thirdly, the Commission noticed that the advent of financial technology had significantly aided MSMEs, providing them with the ability to create, market, and offer products domestically, regionally, and internationally. Entrepreneurs then themselves became the middleman in transactions. Technology rapidly advanced this crowdfund trend. And at the time, the World Bank predicted that by 2025, crowdfunding initiatives would raise approximately $93 billion worldwide. That figure has since been eclipsed approximately 3 years before the predicted deadline. The Commission then sought the need to provide regulatory clarity for this area, allowing businesses to raise capital, but doing so in a manner that protected investors and customers, caused for the development of fair and efficient markets, and reduced systemic, and contagion risks. Initially, we conducted a benchmarking exercise comprising approximately 10 jurisdictions. We then consulted with international and local financial services firms, regulatory agencies, and other stakeholders, and the entire process took about 2 years. And during this process, we were guided by the notion of same risks, same regulation. And as such, the commonly accepted securities regulatory principles, such as the timeous and transparent disclosure of information, proper corporate governance and internal controls, and the segregation of client assets and company funds, all espoused by the IDB and other standard-setting bodies, are cohesively incorporated into the crowdfunding rules. However, we also recognize that crowdfunding was unique and that a bespoke regulatory environment was required. This curated yet holistic approach to the development of our crowdfunding rules, we believe, would allow the sector to organically grow and develop, while allowing the Commission to nimbly respond to developments in this evolving sector. And regarding our strategy and our next steps, and again to echo Professor Altman and Dr. Sabato, the Commission continues to monitor the space to provide guidance to stakeholders and to determine whether additional amendments to our regulatory framework are required. In the very near future, the Commission will provide further regulatory clarity regarding certain issues surrounding crowdfunding as it relates to registration, ongoing requirements, and supervision by releasing a policy statement and a frequently asked questions log. With respect to its communication with investors and other stakeholders, the Commission has relied on various tools and initiatives to support its crowdfunding regulatory framework, including the Securities Commission of the Bahamas' FinTech Hub, SCB FitLink. Launched in 2019, SCB FitLink serves as the central point of contact for the Commission's engagement with the public on various issues related to the securities and capital markets, including crowdfunding. I would invite all of you to please feel free to contact us if you have questions related to crowdfunding or any of our other regulatory initiatives. In the interest of time, I will stop here, but I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that you may have. Diego, again, thank you so much for inviting the Securities Commission to participate in this, and happy to provide any questions or responses that are asked. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Christian. This was very enlightening. I'm going to turn back to Spanish, and I'm gonna ask Mr. Córdoba about scalability in Ascenso. Voy a volver a español.
I will now go back to Spanish, and I wanted to ask, for starters, to production to please show us all the members of the panel, turn their cameras on, and we will now start with Dr. Juan Pablo Córdoba. Dr. Juan Pablo, which are, in your view, your possibilities to escalate Ascenso? One of the points mentioned by Dr. Altman in his talk this morning was the difficulty of finding institutional investors and investments that may be of interest to them. And this has to go through a certain process. And in Italy, it took a number of years for institutional investors to start looking at the mini bonds. So in your view, which are your views about the perspectives in Colombia and about the entire region? Because right now, with your holding and with the merge of the stock exchanges, your market will be expanded. Thank you so much, Diego. I will take the liberty of making a comment with regard to what Christian just said about the regulation of crowdfunding, which, in my view, the experience of the Bahamas, Colombia, and many countries who have decided to go through the regulatory path, I believe that that is the right thing to do. Nevertheless, I would like to invite all regulators who are listening to us today, or the representatives, that the commitment of having a flexible framework should be the truth, because we always say it's flexible, but in the end, we end up with the paradigms of the traditional formal financial market for big corporations, which excludes MSMEs and small investors. So I would like to launch this invitation, and I would like to ask you at the IDB, you, Diego, who have a lot of possibilities to influence, to ask the regulators to truly be flexible. And I want to mention a specific point mentioned by Dr. Christian. I understand that all regulators do it with the best of intentions. It is the issue of meeting international standards of AML. For the client onboarding, we demand a full compliance on anti-money laundering and combating financing for terrorism. And that is fine. But as you can tell, in Colombia, the average investment is of $250. So if I have to do a full AML to a client who has never invested, and they're going to come to invest $250 in 10 or 15 campaigns, I am truly imposing a regulatory burden to the digital platform, which is very difficult to meet and satisfy. So there should be a dialogue which doesn't match. I want more crowdfunding, I want more inclusion, but then I impose too much regulation. So I'm asking Christian to help me out on this, because one of the international discussions on AML is that there has to be a proof of address. And the proof of address means that the document, such as a driver's license, already has the physical address of the person. But in Colombia and the majority of Latin American countries, this is not a fact. So the proof of address should be done through alternative ways, which will increase the cost of any fintech to find out whether the person who is investing $250 really lives where they say they live. So in Colombia, we have a very flexible onboarding process, very flexible. It does not ask me to do a full onboarding and a proof of address if the investor brings me, I'm not sure about the amount, but less than $3,000. I have a simplified onboarding process. So I do not have, as a sense of the burden of proof. The regulator provided this as a blanket authorization, because in the normal world of AML, the burden of proof is always in the hands of the intermediary, and this increases costs. If we inverted these regulation, where there was a blanket authorization to have a digital onboarding of clients in a cost-efficient ways, and when they reach a certain threshold of $3,000 or $5,000, then I do go to full onboarding. This would help the conversation a lot. But right now, Gafi and what the regulators at the world level decide is that you have to do the due diligence, full onboarding before the person can start investing even $1 peso. And that is extremely costly, and it does not help financial inclusion. Yes, I totally agree. This is a key issue. And I believe that Christian is in agreement. I think that Christian already knows about this issue. And without a doubt, technology can save us a lot of cost. And this does not have to be, as you said, the proof of the driver's license or the identity document or the unique document for identity, depending on the country. It can be a mixture of documents which electronically are inexpensive to obtain, and they allow us to know that the person is who the person says he or she is, and that the person is based wherever they say they are. Last year, we published a document about digital onboarding, which facilitates the life of regulators. We obviously need to land on reality. Yes, because the guidelines are there, but on the day you request the licensing, the full compliance is demanded and full diligence. So this does not go forward. So I am glad to see that Christians seem to agree, at least with our intentions. With scalability, there is an important challenge on the two fronts, the front of institutional money, as you mentioned, which are mentioned by Professor Altman. The proof of success is something that we have. The traditional financial sector, unfortunately, will demand long years of track record in order to generate confidence. And I think that that is unfortunate, because then it is a problem of the chicken and the egg, because you don't have critical mass, the investors don't look at you, and if they don't look at you, then you do not grow. So this is a reality. If we leave things as they are, the scalability challenge is going to be very great, and it's going to take a long time. And I believe that the multilateral financing institutions, we were trying to propose to you and to the IFC and to the World Bank to see how could we create a sort of fund with seed capital from institutions such as the multilaterals, which would allow to use institutional money, delegating to third parties the management of their portfolios. So instead of having to invest $100 million in a pension fund, put 10, but this will be managed by a third party, which has support from the IDB or the World Bank, and that is subsidizing for a certain time this financing vehicle, because otherwise it's going to take a very long time to obtain a goal. So I believe that there in an intermediary stage, we need some sort of vehicle with the agreement of the multilaterals and some sort of subsidy for the operation of this vehicle, because an investment fund of $10 million for MSMEs will not have the money to pay for the cost. It needs to be subsidized. And this conversation is a conversation we would like to have, and we will continue insisting that institutions should invest directly, but that is practically impossible. But we have another challenge, which is the challenge for the corporations. Part of Ascenso's success, and we must say this clearly, is that we have a public guarantee on 50% of the credit for the MSMEs. So for an investor, they have a certain confidence because they're only risking 50% of the capital because the state is guaranteeing the other 50%. But this guarantee of 50% has a ceiling. I'm not sure what the ceiling is. 6 million Colombian pesos, which is about a bit more than $1 million. So if a corporation needs financing for more than $1.5 million, it will not have the guarantee from the state. So in order to scale this up, we need greater corporations with larger financing needs, but those corporations do not qualify for an MSME guarantee. So this we have to see how we can extend the guarantee to up to $5 million in order to have 50% of $5 million in order to create this critical mass, because if we do not have a critical mass, things are going to be very difficult. So we have challenges. I will not continue speaking, but I invite you to look at the video, which I included in the chat. Yes, the video is in the chat, and many people have asked about which sectors is Ascenso working on and which are the requirements for the MSMEs. And part of that information is there, and we have already left you the webpage of Ascenso on the chat. Thank you so much, Juan Pablo.
Really fast, Christian. I just wanted to, I saw that you had a reaction to Mr. Cordoba's words, which I really appreciate. If you could tell us your thoughts on digital onboarding and in general on the regulations for crowdfunding and how to actually implement and enact them. I don't know, Christian, if you're there.
Yes, I'm here, Diego. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, certainly. Sorry. So I must say that, Juan Pablo, you're absolutely correct, 100%. As a regulator, we can't say that we are trying to encourage MSME development, but then utilize traditional legislation and rules and procedures to govern those enterprises. Of that, you're absolutely right. And so one of the issues that we wrestled with at the Commission was, how do we incentivize small businesses to access funding? And so what we determined was that we really needed a bespoke regulatory framework, a framework that was separate and apart from traditional financial institutions, that could specifically meet the rules of MSMEs as we understood them to be, based on our discussions with MSEs in the jurisdiction. And to your point with respect to AML KYC, again, I echo that 100%. We did not believe that you needed to have traditional AML KYC surveillance on negligible investment amounts. And so generally speaking, if you are going to invest in a crowdfund operation or in any other of the legislative framework in the Commission, the digital assets, crypto framework, for example, there is a de minimis threshold of $1,000. So up to that point, and that's US dollars. And so up to that point, the full gambit of AML KYC due diligence is not required. We just need to know your name. And then of course you'll have to certify that you're okay taking on the risk that is associated with the investment. But other than that, that's all we require. And then it's in excess of 1,000 is really when the traditional AML KYC thresholds kick in. So yes, certainly that was a very valid point, Juan Pablo, and certainly that we try to adhere to across all aspects of our legislation.
Christian,
yes.
No, sorry, you were saying something else.
So just following up with respect to your digitization and the acceptance of onboarding, I should say, for lack of a better term, but onboarding requirements in a digitized format. We had always had a policy where we had accepted digitized documents, but I think for all regulators, COVID completely changed the game for us. And it forced us to rely on the digitized submission of documents, both from a company and from a natural person benefit. And so today, we accept both hard copy as well as digitized due diligence, as well as registration information from all potential registrants and licensees. And again, if we are to say that COVID had a positive effect on the way that a regulator conducted its business, that was certainly one of the positive effects that we've had. Yes.
Yeah, that's that happened in your jurisdiction and some other ones, and but we do think that we need some steps forward all across the region to ease the way that we onboard our clients. And it would be nice. I don't know, Christian, if you have a link to the onboarding procedures in the securities market in Bahamas, it would be great to take a look at them, and probably it would be interesting for other regulators that are participating in our regional policy dialogue.
Sure,
Juan
Diego,
Pablo,
we certainly
yep.
do, and I'm happy to post it there, but just for the purposes of the discussion. So the Commission utilizes what's called a CORI platform, C-O-R-I rather, I'm sorry. And so all documents can be submitted to the Commission via that platform, which we found reduces both the human capital and the expense of filing. And yes, I'm happy to drop that inside in the chat.
Yeah, Query is being used by not only by you, but also private entities to solve the digital onboarding issue. That's a fair point there, and no commercial intended, but we know about this platform, and it's interesting. It's an alternative of many more in the market. Juan Pablo was going to say something. Juan Pablo?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to commend Christian for that view. I think that the minimus rule is definitely the way to go. And as a matter of policy, it seems like the right approach, in the sense that if you want to have financial inclusion, you need to open an opportunity for people to try the product. So if you have a threshold, sufficiently high threshold that allows people to try the product, and then if they decide that they want to invest more, then you can do the whole cost-effective or whatever process of full onboarding. So the $1,000 threshold for Bahamas seems appropriate. The case of Colombia is more like 2,000. I would be more inclined to a level of 2,000 and invite all of the regulators in the region and in the Caribbean to take that approach, because it really allows for fintechs to offer their services and promote financial inclusion.
That's a pretty fair point, and from IDB, we are willing to cooperate to that extent. We also posted here in our chat the document that I was talking about on digital onboarding, and all regulators, please take a look at it. There are alternative ways of doing things. With this, I would just like to derive some conclusions. We talked about factoring and the way factoring and dematerializing invoices can be an alternative for the entrance of MSMEs into capital markets. We also talked about the successful enterprise of Ascenso and the way they are doing businesses and how we could scale. And there's a challenge posted. I think that the multilateral support that BBC is requiring makes a lot of sense. And probably I will talk to my colleagues in IDB Invest to see, and IDB Lab to see what we can do from our end. And I think that it's a great example of how to do, let's say, how to include, actually include MSMEs into the financial sector. We also talked about the regulations in Bahamas to enable the entrance of new participants. One quick question, Christian. Somebody asked here if these rules apply for startups.
Yes, so the rules apply. So you're limited based on annual gross income. So as long as your annual gross income does not exceed $3 million US, you are classified as an MSME, and yes, the rules apply to you.
Great. So in fact, startups would qualify there. So this regulation applies also for startups. It's an enabler. And the great conclusion also from Colombia and Bahamas is that regulation is required to move forward. So the call for action for regulators here is that with no framework, there's no movement, and we need that framework posted so we can move and we can help the MSME sector to be financed. And again, you have the support of IDB, and we can help if you want to move forward with that. So with that, I would like to thank Juan Pablo, Miguel Angel, who's not here, and also Christian. Thank you very much. This was a great conversation. I think that we touched base upon more than we were expecting. Digital onboarding is key also. So I would like to make a call for action on that point too. And with that, I would like to just move forward to what we will have tomorrow. I'm going to switch to Spanish now to invite over everyone to CapiLAC for tomorrow. Entonces me paso a español muy rápidamente.
So I'm now switching to Spanish. Tomorrow, we'll have some very interesting discussions about technology in capital markets. First of all, thank you for reminding me. There's the survey that we need you to complete. Please read these QR codes with your mobile phones. We want to receive your feedback. I don't think we can improve much on the panels we've had today. We've had so many experts with us, but it's always complicated to get all these experts to come together. But we'd also like to know if you thought that it was organized properly, if you like the topics, if you think there are topics that should be included in CapiLAC 2023. Please, we welcome your comments. And remember, you can also send comments and suggestions to capilac@iadb.org. That's our email. and we'll be very happy to read your comments there as well. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about technology. Please show on screen who our guests are for tomorrow, if you could, technical team. Anyway, we have a roster of people coming from the fintech ecosystem, a company called Warren. What they do is help people, just common people, invest in the stock market. This is from Brazil. Then we have the example of the securities depositories represented by ACSDA, and how markets have evolved toward better technologies, the adoption of better technologies, so that they can have much quicker compliance. And then we'll have the experience from Brazil, from the perspective of a regulator, telling us how they have enabled the creation of regulations that allow for a fintech ecosystem, but also allow for the evolution of technology to apply to capital markets. It will be moderated by my friend and colleague, Gabriela Andrade. Like me, she is a fan of technology and she knows a lot about the topic as well. So we could not hope for a better moderator for tomorrow. And also tomorrow we'll have a presentation on the blockchain bond issued by IDB Invest this year. It will be a very short conversation with the issuer of the bond. We'll talk to IDB Invest and we'll talk in general terms about what this experiment consisted of and what the lessons learned are. There will be a phase 2 with the participation of Colombia's securities exchange and an investor in addition to housing. And we'll tell you more about it tomorrow. So you are more than welcome to join us tomorrow for this panel, where we'll have housing, the Financial Superintendents of Colombia, the IDB, moderated by a person who has helped us organize this CapiLAC, Ana Maria Zárate. This is the second panel of the day tomorrow. And thank you once again to Ana Maria for all her efforts coordinating CapiLAC. This concludes the meeting for today. Thank you to our panelists. Have a great afternoon, everyone. I hope you can still watch our World Cup games this afternoon. Thank you very much. Thank you, Juan Pablo. Thank you, everyone.